Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our study today. We appreciate you taking the time to call in. And if you're watching this later on, again, pray that it is a blessing unto you. And that's the focus of all of this. And the reason we get together is just to be an encouragement and to bring strength if we can. So I hope you find that in today's lesson. We are in Judges chapter 3. And again, this is a lot to take in as every week we look at what these Israelites are going through, the up and downs that they are experiencing. And there's a couple of very interesting verses here. It says in verse 1 of Judges chapter 3, these are the nations which the Lord left to prove Israel by them, even as many of Israel had not known the wars of Canaan. So a few weeks ago, we looked at the word prove or testing that again, this was not that God needed to be certain what was going to happen because he obviously knew what the outcome was going to be and what the future holds, but it's more of a testing of of their own strengths and abilities that many times we don't know what we're capable of. We don't know what we can do. It's kind of like going to the gym, that you might be lifting weights and you start at a lower weight and you build yourself up and you're always hoping to achieve a weight that you've never reached before. That type of testing of building your strength, and that's the comparison here by this word approve or testing. And of course, when it says they had not known the wars of Canaan, so this is given the indication that these are the not the adults, but the younger ones that have maybe not participated in those wars that occurred during the 40 years that they were wandering in the wilderness. Again, this is kind of interesting, especially when you get to verse 2. It says, only that the generations of the children of Israel might know to teach them war, at the least such as knew nothing thereof, nothing thereof. This verse stuck out to me, and I needed to go and take a look at it in the Hebrew. Just a couple very interesting things. The first one I just want to show you is that the word for war is what I'm circling with my cursor here. And again, it's in Hebrew characters, but what's so cool about the Hebrew is embedded in the letters of this word for war is these three words here that I don't know if I can highlight them to kind of show you. Yeah, right here in blue. This is Lamed, Het, and Mem, and it is the word for bread. That's what I found so interesting is embedded in the root word for war is the word lechem, which you may see that the sound is similar to Bethlehem or Bethlehem. Bethlehem means, and Beit means house, Lechem means bread, Bethlehem means house of bread. Well, here in the midst of the word for war, which is milchamot, is the word lechem. And so the uh, root etymology of this says that way, way back when wars were first came upon us, I guess, they were fought mainly for food to survive. If someone was besieging you or someone had food, I don't know what the reason for or against, but the basis for the wars to begin with were over food, were over bread and survival. And so interesting that the survival of eating was bread was buried in the root word for war. So a little bit of Hebrew word knowledge there. But what was so interesting that they had to learn war. They might be taught war. The word learn here um, Lamid, which is where you get the word disciple from. It's to learn, it's to study. And this really kind of bothered me. Why did they have to learn that? And what went through my mind was some prophetic verses of what we're looking for the afterlife to be, heaven, if you will. And this one comes from the book of Isaiah, chapter 2, verse 4, and it says, "They will beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks, neither shall nation lift up sword against nation." But here's the key verse, "Neither shall they learn war anymore." You'll find this same verse is repeated again in the book of Micah, chapter 4, verse 3, so word for word, verbatim. And the emphasis being on when mankind reaches a point where God is completely in control and ruling, no one will have to learn war anymore. And so that was a beauty of this, and thinking, okay, what's going on here? And why did the children of Israel, meaning the young ones growing up that had not participated in these wars, why was it necessary for them to learn the art of war? And unfortunately, we know that mankind being what it is, and even in today's society in which we think that we are sophisticated and educated, and that we understand the need for civility, you would think that with all the tools we have at our disposal and all the education and all the ability to communicate like never before, that people would understand people and that there would never be a war. There'd never be anybody oppressing anyone else or reaching out to harm anyone else because we would have risen above that. Obviously, we are far from that with all that's going on in the world, in the Ukraine, and numerous other places where there are wars and rumors of wars, and even in our own country where there's such division and such hatred, and people are um, threatening one another and harming and uh, courting violence towards one another. And there isn't any group that seems to be immune from those within that group that are acting out in a violent way, seeking to promote their own desires. And yeah, this is challenging. It can be really saddening. It can be really depressing, if you will, other than we look at Isaiah chapter 2, verse 4, and we look at Micah chapter 4, verse 3, and knowing that God is still in control, that there is coming a day when people won't have to learn war anymore, that there will not be this um, essence in a person that causes those to be oppressors and those to harm other people. And we can only pray that, that time will come speedily. Um, and I know it's all in God's timing. Uh, We just don't know the day nor the hour. So, moving on from there, we see that God had somehow left the five lords of the Philistines, all the Canaanites, Zidonians, and the Hivites, and that dwelt in Lebanon, and that these people were here, seemingly left by God to make Israel stronger, to test them in a way that they would grow by them. And again, that's understanding the way that this was. It's a time at those times. So these names and everything were kind of interesting to me. So because I like maps, I went and found some maps here that showed Israel during the time of the judges, and it showed in colors these other nations. We see Israel kind of in this olivey color here, and we see these other nations in various other colors. Um, Aram, which is Syria, sometimes known as Mesopotamia, is up in this kind of reddish color. Then you have the Phoenicians in this little orange color, the Canaanites in this really drab green. You have the Philistines in this kind of a yellowish color. And then you got the Ammonites in this brownish, yellowish color. Then you have the Moabites in a brown. And then you have the Edomites, which are the descendants of Esau. So kinsmen to the Israelites, but obviously not their friends. And then down here in this really light tan, you have the Amalekites. So in the midst here is Israel surrounded by all these others that were not happy that they were there, taking their land. So you can see that it's not a stretch for any of them to get there and and do this. What's interesting though is some of the, there's more countries here than the names that God had given. And some of them we don't even know who they are. If we look at the Hivites, historians say no one really knows who they are. They've kind of disappeared and there's no history, no archaeological evidence for them. But what's interesting is in this one that we couldn't find who they were, the Bible gives us some boundaries where they dwelt in Lebanon. And even the mountain of Mount Hermon, we'll see that later on as we look at another map. And so they were left there. Um, Israel obviously isn't going to follow the commandments, and you know, these are being used by God to strengthen them as the ultimate goal. And so verse 5 says, These children of Israel dwelt among the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. The Perizzites are also a group of people that are mentioned in the Bible, but really haven't shown up on any historical documents. So we don't know how big they were. We just know that they were there and they did exist. Things are looking gloom. Things are looking not so good for them. They're surrounded. There's going to be wars. This isn't, all the land of milk and honey. It's there, but yes, in the midst of the pleasantries and the milk and honey, there are the negatives. There's the wars that are going to be fought. And again, I'm sure there can be sermons that are created about that thought as to, in the midst of all of our pleasure, all of our supply, we still struggle with all the things of life, and we still struggle trying to get along with people, basically, and people who are different than us, people who have different values than us, people who have different cultures than us, and that's really sad if you think of it, that um, times haven't changed. We haven't seemingly gotten better. We haven't become more. Um, of better people and better at communicating and better at getting along and breaking down barriers and differences and walls that things have not gone the way we philosoph- philosophically would have liked things to go. And I think it's the simple answer is because there is selfishness in the world, there's sinful nature in the world, and as long as people are selfish, they're going to be trying to get what's best for them and not care about others. And we strive with that from the moment we're born. We're taught to be selfish. We cry, we get fed. We cry, we get our needs met, and we basically spend the whole rest of our life trying to undo selfishness and learn how to be selfless and how to be charitable and how to be kind and how to have an open heart of generosity. All those things really don't come very natural for us. And God's presence within us uh, is a lifetime lesson. We are works in progress for God's Spirit to bring about a desire to be holy, a desire to be like Him. And so that's how I uh, process this, that when I read these things and they're somewhat disturbing, or I see the news and the atrocities and the inhumanity that's going on, I have to process it by knowing that only as we let God work within us can these roots of selfishness be um, lessened and hopefully someday taken from myself and from us all. So here we see something that's heading downward path here for these Israelites, that as they dwelt among the Canaanites, they had very strict instructions from God not to intermarry, to only marry amongst themselves, keep their lives pure, keep their religion pure, keep their servitude to God pure, but it obviously took a downturn. And I think what's interesting here is what caused this to occur. It doesn't say that they went and happily joined all their parties and idolatrous ways, but it began with desires that were more inward and more selfish, at that they saw their daughters and they took them to be their wives. and then they gave their daughters to the sons of these Israelites. So it began in a very carnal, selfish way of pleasure, of there must have been something about the daughters of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites that was attractive. They obviously uh, probably dressed differently, had different customs, had different levels of modesty and immodesty that attracted, made these daughters attractive. And again, the allure of the unknown, the allure of the exotic, um, we don't have to think too hard on that to see that that still exists in our cultures today. And it was their downfall. It was the intermarriage that began because they were attracted to them, and what I don't see, though, is what happened when the Israelite daughters were given to the sons of these Canaanite nations. We're going to see that on one hand, this was detrimental to the men in Israel that they followed after the religion and the paganism of the daughters of which now became their wives. But was there any reverse effect? Did the Israelite daughters were they able to convince their pagan husbands to follow the one true God of Israel? Um, Obviously, you would like that to be the case, but it doesn't say that. So you wonder if just by the manner of degrading themselves to be in relationships that were ungodly, that they lost that power, they lost that edge of staying godly and staying true to the one true God. And by giving themselves in, started this downward progression that led to idolatry. And again, doesn't take a lot of thought to see that, you know, big sins don't start as big sins, they start as small sins. They start as small things that seemingly are insignificant, and that tends to gain momentum like a snowball rolling. It picks up size, it picks up momentum, and that we always have to guard ourselves on the small things because they desensitize us and cause us to be somewhat unaware that the small things turn into bigger things. So again, a whole lot of message in these few little verses here. And I think with that, we're going to just take a pause and stop at verse 6 and pick up on the rest of it next week. We have another nice map to look at as we look at how God reacts to this and responds. So I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. Again, thank you so much for joining this, and certainly pray that God's blessings will be upon you all. Bye bye, and see you again.